Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us for today's webinar, Best Practices to Achieve M&A Success. I'm Shay Mann, and I will be your moderator today. Today's webinar is in listen-only mode, so if you have any questions throughout the event, go ahead and submit those in the Q&A panel, and we will answer them during the Q&A session at the end of the presentation. We will be recording today's session, and we'll email you a link to that recorded version tomorrow. Joining us today is Neil Coy. Neil Coy is the Global Vice President, Professional Services here at SailPoint and is committed to helping customers successfully adopt identity governance. Also joining us is Rahul Kakani. He's the Senior Director and leads the Identity Governance and Privileged Access Management functions at THOMSON REUTERS. He spent 13+ years in identity management and brings a unique perspective, having successfully delivered large, complex identity transformation programs. And last but not least, we have Gaurav Sheth. He is a Senior Manager in the Identity and Access Management practice within EY. He has been in the IAM space for close to 14 years, involved in all aspects from strategy, design, and engineering services. And most recently, he's focused on leading complex identity transformation engagements stemming from mergers and acquisition transactions. All right, we have a lot to cover today. So Neil, I'll pass it over to you to get us going.
Thank you very much, Shay. Welcome, everyone. We've certainly got a fun agenda for today. So the first thing we're going to talk about is mergers, acquisitions, and then some of the identity challenges that come along with it. From there, we're going to quickly set the foundation for M&A success, and then we'll spend the majority of the time going through our panelists and discussing industry insights. Of course, we'll leave a couple of minutes for questions and answers at the end. So let's talk a little bit about the realities of today. What do we see out in the marketplace? What are we hearing from our clients and prospects? So first, kind of the question on everyone's mind is how quickly can I see return on investment? So one of the fundamentals that we hear all the time is that M&A transactions have a very large chance of running into problems. Effective integration is the single most important contributor to a successful transaction. With that being said, 53% of organizations report that they have encountered a critical cybersecurity issue or incident during an M&A deal. So today we're going to focus on 3 areas of the M&A and divestiture challenge. We'll quickly hit on kind of the pre-merger. So what are those things that we need to do prior to day one activities? Of course, we'll talk a little bit about day one activities, success around that, and then what do you need to do to continue on with that success post day one? So I'd like to quickly set the foundation. I will pass things over to Gaurav.
Thanks, Neil. So Neil mentioned about the 3, phases, as organizations go through a complex acquisition or a divestiture, right? It's the first, the pre-integration or the planning phase, right? The second phase is the day one integration phase, and then you have your post implementation or post day one phase, right? Now, typically, whenever a transaction gets announced, right, or a company is going through this process, right, during the planning phase, what are some of the challenges or pain points that we hear from our customers, right? And that's what we're going to try to pick a few or some of the key ones that we typically hear. And I think this may well resonate with, if your organization is going through a transaction, may very well resonate with you guys as well, right? So number one is, all right, so the transaction is announced. How do I plan for my day one, cross-organizational collaboration and access needs, right? And what is the end user impact going to be, come day one? As part of the transaction, whether it be an acquisition or a divestiture, right? Is this supporting the transaction? Is this going to be increasing my licensing and infrastructure and support costs? Or will my existing, sets of investments in these technologies be able to cater to the requirements of the transaction as well? Number 3, TSAs or the transitional service agreements, right? There are certain mandates and deadlines that organizations need to adhere to. How will I, or will I be, I mean, there's no other, option, right? I mean, you have to meet these deadlines, otherwise there's financial repercussions. So what are the things that I need to take care of to be able to meet those, pieces? And then, really from a cloud adoption strategy, right? I mean, I'm already on a cloud adoption journey, right? How can we really speed up things and move on to, really accelerate some of the things, right? And a few of the pieces is really around complexity, right? I mean, is this transaction going to be really increasing my complexity? Can I really meet my audit and compliance requirements, right? And just not the assistance with the transaction, how can I leverage the momentum that I have as part of the acquisition of a divestiture and really make sure that the investments that I'm making as an organization are really future-proofing, for further acquisitions or a divestiture type scenario. So again, I'll pass it back to Neil, but some of the things that we hear, from our customers that are going through an acquisition or a divestiture type of a transaction. Back to you, Neil.
Thanks, Gaurav. So let's quickly go through how to set M&A success. So as most of us know, planning is paramount. As you start this process, make sure that you're planning for the complex M&A IT tasks, making them simple and streamlined from day one. From there, we highly recommend to audit as many of the day one activities as you can. This will increase your ROI and then limit the human errors that you're going to run into during that day one, which will ultimately lower the number of help desk calls that you get based on errors and things like that. From there, highly recommend to automate your password resets and access requests. Again, this will help to reduce those day one help desk calls. If you can reduce those help desk calls and the errors that people come into on that first day, it just ultimately boosts morale and makes that transition a little easier as you go through it. From there, quickly onboard your applications and files to ensure the right users and groups can access them quickly. And then prepare for your auditors. As you're going through your project, have a side task that revisits your auditor's needs. That shouldn't just be a planning for, that should be something that is each point and milestone in that M&A process, you revisit and streamline as much as possible. So when your auditors do come in, you can go ahead and quickly show them all of the compliance reports that they need to make that part of the process a little smoother. And then to round this out, strengthen your security by monitoring and remediating access activity. So now we'll switch into industry insights, getting into a couple of questions. So the first question is going to be for Gaurav. Mergers, acquisitions, and divestitures can be an excellent catalyst for identity improvement. Why is it, or why is that, and how can organizations make their identity ecosystems more streamlined and simplified?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I mean, it's really around, right? I mean, as organizations are going through these complex transactions, right, whether it be an acquisition or a divestiture, right? I mean, the focus can really shift to meeting those transaction-specific obligations, right? But again, you could basically take that and flip it around, a little bit, the other way as well, and really leverage the momentum and the type of attention and investments that are being made to really assist in the transaction, to also at the same time really improve your identity posture as well, right? And a few pieces, just want to highlight a couple of things, right? As part of the transaction, there will be attention and you'll have the focus from the senior executives, right, to really support the program. Right. As an example, you may, as an organization, you may never get the attention or, focus for things like an Active Directory modernization program, but which may become a part of or basically a foundational component to really help with the transaction. So things like that, you think about in mind, right? Cloud adoption journey, right? I mean, you may be on a path to adopting, cloud, either the Azure or AWS or whatever the cloud strategy is. The transaction can really speed things up, wherein you have the relevant application teams, the data center teams involved, right? and they may have, and most likely they will have an identity requirement as well. We have to make sure that you're addressing those requirements as these workloads are going into the cloud. So that's the other piece. And again, the next couple, business enabler and user experience, right? If you flip it around and focus around, talking about that identity is really a business enabler from a transaction perspective. That identity will help, solve some of those complex cross-company access types of scenarios, help improve eventually, from a user experience perspective as well. There's going to be, a lot more, and you can basically flip that around and make that as an enabler as well, and not just focus on, identity helping just the separation component. And then finally, to round it up, right, so funding, yes, that's a bigger question, right? So funding does exist to help support the transaction. There will be funds that gets allocated to the identity team as well, more from a CISO organization perspective, right? It's a matter of, how wisely you can leverage those funds to meet your separation goals, as well as really uplift your, IAM program as well. Back to you, Neil.
Thanks, Gaurav. So Rahul, Thomson Reuters has had a couple of fairly large divestitures over the last year or a couple of years, as well as a couple of acquisitions. Can you talk a little bit about the journey that you have walked through?
Sure. So, good afternoon and good morning, everyone. For those of you who don't know, Thomson Reuters, right, like we are one of the world's most trusted providers of answers, right? Like we're a global company spanning 100+ countries, and we provide technology-enabled business solutions, right? Like in law, tax, compliance, government, and media domains, right? Like, I think in my view, right, like think of PR as a technology company. And being a technology company, right, like identity is sort of like, critical to enabling our workforce, to be productive and deliver on company missions, right? Prior to 2018, right, like PR was, had like 65,000 plus identities, 200 plus domains. And again, right, 200 plus baby domains. There's a bit of history here, right? Were a result of numerous M&As that the company went through. Right, like so in 2018, continuing on that M&A journey, Thomson Reuters sold a major part of their, finance and risk business to Blackstone Group for about $18 billion, right? And the new company is known as Refinitiv, and TR retained a 45% stake in Refinitiv, right? Why this is kind of important to kind of stress on is, right, like it was, just the size of the transaction was like almost half of the company that was divested, right? And as a result, right, like, every layer across the company, went through the separation, right? Like to kind of give you a perspective into the scale or complexity, right from, data centers to even corporate network applications, infrastructure assets, AD domains, security tooling, including identity and various teams, everything was sort of, separated and an owner was sort of like identified, right? And, because of the way it was sort of, split, right? Like, it resulted in a numerous, time-bound transition service agreements, right? Between the two companies to provide each of the services till the other can, build their own capability, migrate and exit, right? So, to kind of like give you an example, right? Like you could have a Refinitiv-owned application protected by a TR-owned SSL solution, and a Refinitiv-owned MFA hosted in a Refinitiv data center joined to a TR-AD domain, right? Like, the complexity was just enormous, right? Like, and again, right, like these TSAs are time bound, right? Like they have legal implications that come along with it, given that, from a diversity perspective, these are, two different entities, right? And the goals are aggressive, right? Like, so it is almost like, I would say 5-6 years worth of work across the different identity services that now had to be done in like, 18 to 24 months, right? And we definitely, I would say, leverage separation as a catalyst, as Gaurav sort of highlighted. It is an excellent transformation opportunity to retire legacy, tech debt. But at the same time, it also meant that the legacy complex processes, which hadn't been, touched in years, came with unaccountable unknowns, right? And interdependencies that had to be navigated and untangled, right? Just I think two more things I would like to highlight is around, which kind of added to the divestiture complexity is really the, we put together a massive sort of cloud acceleration program with the lofty goal of moving our 80% workloads to Azure and AWS in about 2 years, right? So as you can imagine, cloud adoption and change was happening at lightning speed. And as you can guess by now, right, like this couldn't have been achievable without going through multiple rounds of deep dive planning. Yeah, back to you, Neil.
So Rahul, if you could go back to day one of your planning for the Refinitiv divestiture, what would you have liked to be able to tell yourself on that day?
So, I mean, I have many things, but if I had to sort of, choose and just kind of crystallize this into one thing, I would definitely sort of, change the way ownership of different identity services between the two companies was laid out, at least from an identity perspective, to kind of help simplify and reduce the complexity a bit. And I do recognize that it is easier said than done because, when we talk about ownership, right, like, I mean, many variables go into that ownership equation, right?
Perfect. So Rahul, staying with you, can you walk us through the differences when going through a divestiture versus an acquisition?
Yeah, this is an interesting question. Having gone through 2 divestitures and 4 acquisitions in the past 2 years here at Thomson Reuters, I would say there are definitely subtle differences between the two. In an acquisition, as an example, like you will basically evaluate how you can scale the existing established patterns and broaden the coverage to the newly acquired apps, infra users, right? Versus in a divestiture, you will have to maintain the legacy access patterns and at the same time transform and build new access patterns, right? Like to be able to meet your TSAs and reverse TSAs, right? Then, cross-company access, right? Like it's really a byproduct of separation. What it is like how you're going to enable the access for users of both companies to each other's applications, right? Landing zone and, not just during detransition, which could be anywhere from 18 months to 36 months, but also, beyond the transition, right? So a good example of that from a cross-company access perspective is your authoritative source separates, right? You have divested users now, right? Like which have gone to the new company or the new divested Refinitiv in this case, right? Like who may be terminated in your, Thomson Reuters authoritative source, but due to the TSAs in place between the two companies, you have a valid business need for their access to continue, during the transition period. Now, whether you continue to treat them as employees or have them onboarded as contractors and cause a mass, sort of change for everyone in the company in the interim or post divestiture, right? Like, I mean, those are some of the sort of decisions or considerations that, go into divestiture versus, in my view, they're quite different when it comes to an acquisition, right? Like from a conversion perspective. In a divestiture, you would be looking at separation to be accomplished at every layer, right? And again, right, like those transition agreements are not like, big bang, right? Like they all come with their own sort of time boxes around them, right? Like, so end users, what ends up happening is end users are hit with high frequency changes, which, again, may or may not exist during an acquisition, right? Like, I mean, you may stand up new identity services on both sides as part of a divestiture and also have legacy access needs to be maintained. So end users may end up with multiple accounts, usernames, and passwords, right? So experience, in my view, in a divestiture kind of like, becomes worse in the interim before it gets better, right? So, the chain management is a big component, and user experience is a big component, and the complexity, right? Like it's really, higher in divestiture, right? Like, and some of the contributing factors that we sort of, reviewed in the previous question, but just to kind of highlight a few more, the existing identity tooling processes get disrupted due to the ownership change, right? Like there's a massive build out of new services across the company and migrations, right? Like you have to untangle multiple interdependencies. There are numerous unknowns, right? Like you almost have to sort of like accomplish the logical separation first, and then you can focus on the actual physical separation from your system standpoint, right? If we talk about compliance drift, right, like the pace of onboarding and offboarding applications to identity services, right, like SSO, PAM, IGA solution, the pace really increased significantly, right? Like so, it leads to a sustained sort of spike in maintaining and accounting for that drift from a compliance baseline perspective, right? So it really sort of gets complex and challenging to ensure compliance in a divestiture scenario, right? And from a data perspective, I would say the data is being migrated and moved across landing zones. Given different data sets from one company may be needed to facilitate the separation objectives of the other company. So there's an increased sort of need for identity governance over data, right? Like who has access to this data? Who is the new owner of this data, right? Like is there PII or any other sort of, company sensitive data, that is being exchanged, and like how do we ensure that the data is being wiped out after, it fulfills the tactical need of separation, right? And just to kind of highlight the last point, which is really around, timeline pressures. I spoke about this, right? Like legal implications to the TSAs and reverse TSAs, aggressive goals to be completed within 18 to 36 months, right? These basically add more constraints on, the respective IAM teams on both sides to kind of move forward with their strategy around transformation, maturity improvements. Kind of also leads to a tendency to take risky tactical decisions, right, to enable separation, like easiest path to success to be able to meet these timelines, which may or may not be the path forward from a security and risk management perspective, right? Like, which is again very different than acquisitions.
Perfect. Thanks, Rahul. So let's switch kind of topics just a little bit, and let's go into kind of the day one activities. So Rahul, can you talk a little bit about how you've ensured productivity on day one?
Sure. So, I mean, whether your company is going through a M&A, has an M&A in sight or a divestiture in sight or not, right? Like I would just kind of like say that assume M&A is imminent and sort of like, bake it in your plans. And that was sort of our approach to when we started sort of improving the maturity, laying out the foundation and strategy for, IAM. We basically sort of baked it into our plans and account for the M&A requirements to kind of future-proof our identity investments, right? Wanted to talk a little bit about the concept of day one, right? Like when you think about divestitures, right, or even an M&A, the concept of day one in my mind sort of doesn't exist, or kind of like is spread across a series of transitions, right? Like you may have a day one for employees when the authoritative source is separate. You may have a day one for contractors when, the authoritative source for contractors, if it's different, separate, right? Like, I mean, if an application separate from an account provisioning perspective, the onboarding, etc. Like there are, like it's like a series of transitions, right? Like, so in order to be kind of like ready for day one, right? Think of it as, define the transitions clearly, right? Like adopt a iterative, MVP approach, right? Like don't try and solve for everything at once. We basically also establish some repeatable sort of and scalable onboarding and offboarding patterns, be it for, the different types of users, for different sources, or manage applications or infra endpoints, right? There was a pattern that was established which kind of helped us, keep on track. With acquisitions, you may also find that your identity footprint suddenly gets expanded into different geographies, right? Like which you may have operated in before or not, which kind of brings different implications from a regulation, data residency, performance requirement standpoint, right? Like so, early on when you're making these choices into your IGA, like what are you going to choose as your IGA toolkit, right? Like the key is to focus on these considerations and flexibility, right? Like when I talk about flexibility, it's not just the flexibility from a perspective of deployment options, right? But a flexibility also from a perspective of solving for like different use cases, handling volume as you grow. Wide technology coverage, right? And again, right, like, I mean, if you have a global user base like us, right, it's important how known this product that you select or this toolkit that you select is, deployed in the other regions of the world, right? Like, I mean, how known it is. Is it just in North America or other places? Because there may be, sort of like, differences in terms of, the usage aspects or the end user experience aspects, right? Early business engagement, I would say, is key in terms of aligning your plans with businesses' plans, and again, positioning identity as an enabler, right? So kind of leads to an increased adoption, makes the journey a little bit easier from a day one perspective, right? Also, like I said, the end user experience, gets worse before it gets better, right? So, I mean, how can we sort of, smoothen the edge a little bit from that perspective, right? Like, how can we provide frictionless onboarding? Maybe implement password synchronization across multiple accounts, right? Like offer self-service access requests. What else? I think from a cross-company access perspective, again, this is a key contributor to simplifying the plans for your business and removing the dependencies and any sort of timelines constraints which they may have from an identity and access management perspective in their plans, right? Like, so if you enable the cross-company access between the two companies, like we did for TR and Refinitiv, right? Like Refinitiv users can access TR assets and TR users can access Refinitiv assets. So it's really now down to the business applications to really decide how and when they want to separate, because they have multiple options to choose from, whether they want to do a big bang in terms of how they want to separate and just allow TR users access to TR applications, or if they have a valid business need for that access to continue for a certain duration, even once they are separated, is there a pattern to enable that, right? So doing this early on kind of takes you out of the equation from being a bottleneck, right, for your business separation. And lastly, I would just say, right, like, I mean, it's not going to be perfect given the complexity, right, like, and the legacy tech that dimension. However, I would say, having right partners in terms of, like in our case, it was SailPoint and EY, who can sort of like quickly adopt and flex where required, definitely, I would say, makes this journey a little bit, easier.
Wonderful. So, Raul, how can identity governance help with regulatory compliance and audits throughout the M&A transaction?
Yeah, so what we noticed when we went to the divestiture in 2018 and until date, right? Like, we're still undergoing separation, right? And we're in that 18 months to that 36 months time frame. We did notice increased hiring as each org, take ISRM as an example, right? Like, I mean, now suddenly there were like, 2 ISRMs, right? Like functions that had to be stood up, 2 IAM teams, right? 2 corporate audit teams, right? So we definitely saw increased hiring. Then, from a perspective of the cross-company access perspective, we saw, I would say, interesting use cases when the authoritative source splits at the top, right? That feeds into your IGA solution, and then there are identity swaps, right? Like where an identity of user shows up as a as an inactive record in an old off source and a new, and then it shows up with the same unique identifier in the new, HR source as active, right? Like, so a lot of rehire scenarios, rebadging of contractors as employees and vice versa. Access reviews, right? Like, I mean, we saw an increased sort of like need to periodically review access as different apps and corresponding access was being transitioned to ensure nobody retained, access beyond what they should have, as when the services were transitioned. Managing continuous compliance, baseline drift with the right controls in place was an interesting sort of use case with services being decommissioned and stood up all the time with the different sort of transitions happening. Again, this is where, in my view, like the fact that we had an IGA solution and some of its capabilities that we implemented around automated birthright provisioning, deprovisioning, access reviews, data syncs really kind of came in handy for us to enable and compliance to be met.
Thank you, Rahul. So, Gaurav, what if a company lacks the necessary resources for an identity program? How can we help those organizations have a successful merger and acquisition transaction?
Yeah, interesting question, right? So, I mean, as you may have heard, right, so from Rahul, and especially how they went through from the THOMSON REUTERS journey, there's definitely a lot of moving pieces, right? And you basically have to think through, and planning is definitely important, as you're developing your plans, right? And I think the important pieces really, again, as what Rahul mentioned, right, an M&A type of a transaction or a divestiture, right? I mean, for your organization is imminent, right? Whether now or sometime in the future, I mean, you have to prepare for it, right? So, having those, plans in place, it really helps, as you're going through it right now or in the future as well. And really to simplify it, right? So, I mean, you can think of, there's definitely a lot of complexity and a lot of, different components involved, a lot of different stakeholders involved. What we typically see, really works well is really breaking down your plan into 3 different buckets, right? Number one is what is your workforce strategy, right? Really is, obviously it's going to be different when it's an acquisition versus a divestiture, as Rahul mentioned. Some of the differences from a use case perspective, how you handle and some of the compliance requirements as well, and even from a timing perspective, right? There's going to be a little bit nuances and differences that you need to understand, right? Other pieces, right? Whether as an organization, if you're going through an acquisition, are you really looking for like a full integration of the 2 organizations, or is it really the acquiring organization is going to be operating independently with a set of common services that you want to provide on either side, right? So that really constitutes your workforce strategy, and really having a good handle on that, and really clear picture and defining that really helps forming the overall plan. So that's number one. Second bucket is your services and your process strategy is really around understanding what your services and your technology stack is, current state, right? Having a good handle from your legacy processes, some of the shortcomings or some of the gaps that you may have identified, right? Good understanding, because a lot of time when you are in a transaction and speed is of the essence, you probably would not have a lot of time to really understand what your existing processes are and really documenting those and having a good handle on that, right? So it really helps having a clear picture from a service and a process strategy perspective. And then whenever you go through a transaction, clearly defining what that operating model is going to be, who the ownership, and the ownership model is going to be, right? Which set of services and technologies retains with one set of organization, which set of services and technology moves on to the other set of organization, and anything that's still common across the board, right? What is the operating model going to look like? So having a good understanding of, helps. That's the second bucket. And then the third one is the cloud or the data strategy, right? Again, you may have presence on-prem, as well as have a strategy to move, cloud as well. There's going to be hybrid situations as well. And from a data perspective, your data is going to be, everywhere, right? Your identity and your directory services data, that's one aspect. Your actual, unstructured data, and who has access to those types of scenarios, right? I mean, again, it's a complex problem to solve. But at least from an overall, vision and a strategy perspective, having that, clarity, helps. And then that really drives what are the specific projects or work streams you have to kick off, whether it be, consolidation of your data, your migration services, and even from an application and a workloads perspective, what application stays, what application moves, all of that is really dependent on your holistic, cloud and data strategy, right? So again, 3 key buckets, I would, say, based on experience and, what we have gone through, you really need to focus on, workforce, services and process, and then the third bucket is your cloud and data piece.
Perfect. Thanks, Gaurav. So now we'd like to open it up to questions. So at this point, I will reintroduce Shay.
Awesome, thank you. Great presentation. Lots of really great insights here. We really appreciate it. Let's go ahead and jump in. We have our first question. Raul, I think this would be a great one for you to answer. So during the divestiture, was Refinitiv able to capitalize on any of the work that had previously been done by Thomson Reuters during the deployment?
Yeah. So I mean, I do see a few Refinitiv folks on this presentation as well. So don't want to speak for themselves for them, but yes, in my view, they were able to definitely capitalize on the existing sort of, I would say, SOC app and infra and point integrations. However, obviously, right, like, they did have to kind of build their own, integrations and workflows suited to their business requirements.
Wonderful, thank you. Okay, here's another question. Let's see. Gaurav, you talked about using the M&A process to improve identity management in an organization. Are there certain metrics that you like to use or recommend using to track that type of improvement?
Yeah, interesting, right? I mean, at the end of the day, right? I mean, no matter what you go through, it all gets down to tracking your maturity against a set of, metrics and KPIs, right? So yeah, no, absolutely, there has to be metrics. I think it's going to vary from one organization to the other, but at a broader level, I would say, you need to, as an organization, you need to understand from a business, commitment perspective, right, and from a CISO organization perspective, what are some of the key things that you're looking to track, right? It could be as, if one of the goals is really to improve your NIST maturity, right, having a good understanding of your current NIST maturity level, and then to what level you want to go to, right? That helps, and then that subsequently, derives the specific, KPIs or metrics, that becomes relevant in order to help improve the maturity, right? The other one is, from a compliance and audit perspective, right? Obviously, the improvement of the onboarding and the offboarding processes, making sure, those are the basic, things that are being handled, and you're satisfying some of your, termination controls as well. Right, again, a key one, and then more granular, right? I mean, it could even be as simple as number of applications and services that are really integrated with your core IAM tool set from an IG and SSO perspective, right? Where do you stand right now? How can you improve that and increase that adoption and integration into the future as well? So again, few pieces as well, right? And then from a privileged access or privileged account perspective, right? Again, a key metric from a security, from a security standpoint, what types of endpoints or types of platforms are currently integrated with your, PAM solution? What capabilities does that provide? Right, and as it relates to your highly privileged accounts, whether you have a good discovery and a handle on what are the different scenarios and use cases, right, and how can you improve and increase the adoption of those PAM solutions as it relates to these different endpoints. So again, the metrics could vary. Really depends on how mature your organization is right now and what from a commitment perspective, what your security or CISO organization has really made a commitment to the business as well.
Got it. Thank you. Okay, our next question. Neil, from a SailPoint perspective, what do you see as the biggest hurdle organizations have to overcome when dealing with a merger or acquisition?
Sure. Thanks, Shane. For me, what we see with our clients and kind of that from a hurdle perspective is really around complexity. When people approach, an acquisition and they're taking on a new organization or even letting someone go, they often try and bring things that weren't necessarily working for them in their old environment to their new environment simply because it was the way that things had always been done. To me, this is an opportunity to, quite frankly, bring in some newer, more modern processes. It's certainly a large hurdle because it adds a little bit of training. But to me, if you can get in front of that training and remove some of the complexity, you'll actually reduce your day one help desk calls and problems and issues that you may run into.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. Well, what an amazing presentation. Raul, Gaurav, Neil, thank you so much for your time today. Thanks for everyone who joined us. Again, we will be sending the recording of this webinar out via email tomorrow, so you're welcome to share it with any colleagues that weren't able to attend live with us today. We hope you have a wonderful rest of your week, and bye for now.
Bye, everyone.